We should now understand the importance of certificates for encrypted communications, but we also need to be aware of the different types of certificates and various ways in which they are used. That's all coming up and more next.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Welcome back to Security Plus here at IT Pro TV. Today's all about certificates, and you might be saying to yourself, Daniel, we've talked about certificates. Well, we've hinted around them, we danced with them a little bit, but we really need to kind of get into a little bit more of the minutia behind certificates. Again, moving toward the different types and where they're going to be used, specifically for the Security Plus exam, if you want to be successful there. Good news is I found Wes roaming the hallways in a daze. I said, hey, you want to talk about certificates? He said, sure.
That's
Here
right.
we are.
Absolutely.
Wes, so when it comes to certificates, obviously, it's not just one certificate to rule them all. There are many ways in which we can see this, right?
That's right. There might be one to rule them all. And if you remember our last episode, that when we set up a PKI, I guess the root could be the one certificate.
I guess I meant one type.
Gotcha. No, there's definitely not.
No.
There's many varieties, and that's what we're really here to talk about. Is just some of the different ways and purposes of these certificates. So let's go ahead and dive in. If you remember in our last episode, we set up a PKI. We stood up the root CA, we stood up the subordinate CA, and then we issued a certificate at the end. Well, remember that this is kind of how that hierarchy looks. You've got a root CA that's the top part of the hierarchy. And then you have the intermediate CA, sometimes called subordinate CA, because it's subordinate to the root in this hierarchical trust model, right? The root CA, it issues itself what's known as a self-signed certificate. And that's one of the certificate types that they call out on the exam. They just say self-signed. What does that mean? Well, that means I signed my own certificate. That's really what it boils down to.
So can I just spin up a server and self-sign a certificate,
Absolutely,
bury it in the ground, and go, I am now dishing out certs like it's going out of style?
Yeah, absolutely. None of them to be trusted, though.
The recognition is where, right?
That's right.
I'm assuming there's some sort of organization that verifies these are good.
Yeah, definitely. So, when we were talking about PKI, we set up, what we set up was that internal public key infrastructure, something that we would have inside of our organization versus an external. Somebody like DigiCert, somebody like VeriSign. These are the companies out there that basically assign these certificates to identities or entities, if you will, so that we can validate they are who they say they are. So know the difference between those types of certificates and why that first one there is called self-sign. It establishes the first part of that chain of trust. It issues the certificate, if you will, to the intermediate CA. Remember, the root's also called the offline, right? And we have that now established chain of trust. And when you validate these certificates, you go through what is known as technical terms here, certificate chain validation. What does that mean? It just means you presented me with a certificate. I'm going to go up the tree, up the ladder, and I'm going to say, subordinate CA, let me see your certificate. All right, it's valid. Root certificate authority, let me see your certificate. Okay, it's valid. I trust the certificate. Let's move on with our encrypted communications.
All right, so now that we get a little primer, a reminder of what we were talking about in our previous episode, let's move that on. Let's start talking about how certificates are used for the actual machines themselves, right? This is a way in which we can employ this.
Definitely. So you can have machines that actually do enrollment themselves. Now, you could issue these out as well, but you could also do something known as auto-enrollment. Remember that we talked about something known as the Simple Device Enrollment Protocol, SDEP, yes, make sure I get that right. And Microsoft in their server, Active Directory Certificate Services, they implement that through something known as NDES. It's Network Device Enrollment. And I can't remember for the life of me what the S is, but standard, if you will. And that basically allows, for instance, a router, a server, if you will, that can issue request certificates. Let me show you what I mean here. So basically, machine certificates, they can be servers, right? When you go to a web server, think about you do HTTPS communications, right? It's using that certificate to encrypt the communications, or at least start that encryption process. Things like remote access servers. And again, these are just examples of various servers that you could use machine certificates for. Keep in mind, you also have things like proxy servers, right? A proxy server is a server that sits in between you and a web request, right? Well, you need to verify that the proxy wasn't just stood up by somebody randomly and it shouldn't be trusted, or it should be trusted. Nobody.
Never happens.
Nobody. That's right. So know that machine certificates they can be issued to servers. All right, and they can basically authenticate the server and verify that the server is who they say it says it is. It can also be client machines as well. Things like workstations, if you will, laptops. We also have things like network devices. Right, network devices can also be issued certificates so that you can validate and verify the redistribution points, if you will, when you send communications to them. So all different types of machines, if you will, can use certificates and be issued certificates and use them as a form of endpoint or authentication, if you will.
And what's cool is not only can machines get certificates, but the users as well. We can use certificates ourselves for a variety of different purposes.
Most definitely, because one of the best things about using certificates for the user is it's not susceptible to some of the password-based attacks that we've talked about, right? Password humans, we are. We're just...
We are flawed.
We are very flawed individuals, right? And the more complex and more secure we want passwords to be, typically lends itself to writing them down, and it just runs against security anyways. So if you issue a certificate to an end user, then the end user can present the certificate itself, and the certificate itself can be totally controlled by the administrator, all right? And it's not as easy to spoof. Now, I didn't say you couldn't, right? There's people far more technical than I am. But the likelihood of a certificate-based attack versus a password-based attack, the password attack is going to be more common. So we can use these things for things like email. We can use them for things like full disk encryption, and even things like, for instance, proving our identity, right? So user certificates can be issued and, again, used for these various methods.
I like how you just mentioned email there. We definitely like to use certificates in email. Run us down the road of that and what that looks like, if you could.
Sure. So, we've talked about, when we talk about things like secure protocols, we've just kind of briefly mentioned SMIME, right? Secure Multimedia Internet. Let's try this again. Secure Multimedia Internet Mail Extensions, right? So SMIME, it works on public key cryptography, which means we're going to have a certificate that's issued out to a user for the purposes of email, right? That's going to be an associated key pair, right? We've talked about this before, and if this person on the left wants to send the gentleman on the right some kind of encrypted email communication, he's going to first reach out, grab his public key. Once he's got that public key, he's going to take that public key, just like we've seen in asymmetric key encryption. He's going to encrypt the email message, and it's going to send it back over to the person's public key that did the encryption. All right. Then that person is going to take their public or their private key, the one that is only available to them, or at least should be, or the whole thing is flawed. Going to take that private key and can actually decrypt the email. So that essentially is how it works with SMIME.
Yeah, and it's really cool is you can take your public key and you can put that in like the body of your email or in your signature even, and it's a great way of propagating those public keys around, and then you can just import those right into your mail clients and start encrypting and having a grand old time with that stuff. Most mail clients have some sort of functionality in there to put those keys in and use that SMIME function. Very cool stuff. Let's move on to code signing. You kind of preempted us there, but hey, what the heck? The man is ready. He wants to get into code signing. A really great way of using certificates, might I say.
Definitely, and this is one that you probably use more than you know it, especially if you think about a Windows machine. And it isn't just something that's limited to Windows. I mean, Mac has it. Linux certainly has it. If you think about all of the Linux-based servers that are out there on the backbone of the internet, they're definitely using it for software that you install. But this is what's known as code signing certificates, right? Code signing certificate essentially proves the identity of the vendor, and it ensures the integrity of the software. Systems, operating systems, we use these code signing certificates to validate things like drivers, right? How many times have you launched an application, or maybe even an installer? Really, let's go to the installer, not just necessarily the application, before it's even installed on your computer. And you see the little shield in Windows, right? Well, that's letting you know that it's going to require administrative access to install that piece of software, but then the user account control triggers. And it says, do you know who you know who the software is? And let's say that I'm installing, I don't know, let's say I'm installing something like Notepad++, right? It shows me the digital certificate, and I can look at that information if I want, and I can verify it. And it verifies to me that it is the people that own and distribute Notepad++, as well as verifying that the integrity of the software has been maintained so that somebody didn't take it off the shelf, slip their code in it, re-encrypt it, and put it back up there, and then I downloaded it, I'm none the wiser. I could pull that software down and I can run the hashing algorithms that they usually post with it, and I could do that same hashing algorithm and compare those outputs, and if the hash function produces the same message digest, I can verify that that software is the software that we expect it to be. Think about things like drivers. Drivers are very, very important pieces of software that deal with the high-level programming language and the low-level code that our hardware runs on. It has very privileged access to the kernel, right? You don't want just any kind of software having privileged access to the kernel. Think about things like rootkits and how nasty they can be, right? We want to verify and validate that kind of communication down at the lower levels, and we want to know where it came from.
Yeah, it does making creating malware a much more difficult process. I heard from a friend anyway. I'll just put it out there. Right. It's a pain in the rear. There's no doubt about it. All right, let's move on to wildcard certificates. These can be really helpful, but they can also be kind of dangerous if they're used incorrectly. So tell us about wildcard certificates.
Sure. So a wildcard certificate really comes down to something like this, right? You have a parent domain. It's used to identify the parent domain, but then it's also used to identify the sub or child domains under. So think about, like, let's say Google.com, right? Google, let's say they've got East, they've got West, they've got North, right? If they issue a wildcard certificate, well, it's going to be represented at the first part of that namespace with an asterisk, and then it'll say .google.com at the end. And that just means that it's also going to be valid for east.google.com, west.google.com, and then down, so on and so forth down the list, right? Some of the examples, the way you might see this represented, for instance, something like this, *itpro.tv. That means that if we have additional subdomains that ITPro TV, the namespace, we own it, and we want to validate it, we can assign a wildcard, and again, it verifies all of the subdomains. I also use the example of Google.com. Google.com is one, or Google in general is one that does this as well, and you can see that inside of their certificates too. So that essentially is the wildcard certificate. Remember, it verifies, validates, if you will, the parent domain and then the subdomains below it.
Yeah, what's fun is when you can do something called subdomain takeover attacks, and then those things are validating those domains that you've taken over. So that can be fun.
So a few years ago, somebody broke in and they stole the private key to a trusted root authority.
I hate to see that happen.
Yeah, I think it was DigiNotar, I think is what it was called, the DigiNotar attack. And somebody got in and stole their private key, and they started issuing themselves wildcards. They were led on to the fact that one was star.com. You don't issue wildcards like that to the entire .com namespace, a top-level domain. But again, it just shows you, like Dan's saying, if something like that's exploited, then that means the certificates below that could be used to attack people regardless of what the namespace is.
That's always a fun time.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah, definitely.
I'm sure somebody lost a job that day. Right?
Absolutely.
All right, let's go into validation certificates. That's an important topic for us.
All right, so I call them validation certificates. Actually, the type of validation you can get surrounding a certificate that you go to a third party and you request, right? So, for instance, let's say let's say we go to GoDaddy and I need a certificate, right? Well, if I want to prove that I own the namespace, right? I'm the owner of that. Let's say SupremeGeekdom.com, right? That's the namespace, right? And they want to validate that I am who I say I am, then I go through domain validation. It's one of the lower levels of domain certificate validation. Doesn't require a lot of information. Now, if you want a little bit more validation, well, you're going to move up the chain a little bit, and you're going to go into what's known as an organizational validation. And then at the end of the day, the highest level of validation is what's called an EV certificate. Let's go ahead and let's double back and let's talk about them, right? Domain validation, or a DV-based certificate, again, it's the lowest level of validation. It just verifies ownership over the domain, that domain itself. Organizational or organization validation, if you will, greater validation than the DV certificate. So we're going up a little bit, and we gotta turn over a little bit more information about our organization to the registrar that we're going to get that certificate from, and they can basically validate a lot more about our company, right? This is ITPro TV. We're in Gainesville. We're at this address. Here's the administrator, right? A lot of things that you got to go through. And then I think the last one's really just a ploy to get money, because the highest form of organization identification, it's the most rigorous validation process. It means when I'm going to get this certificate, not only can you validate the name, the namespace itself, that I'm the owner of the domain or the identity of the organization, I don't think you'd see my tax records, but you can see a lot more information. And again, that's more about that model of trust. This is the highest level of trust when it comes to a certificate that's been issued.
All right. Well, Wes, there's a lot of great certificates that we've looked at, a lot of different ways in which we can see them. Also, probably be good for us to understand or be able to identify those formats in which we see them. And so that when I stumble across a certificate in the wild, maybe stored on a disk somewhere, I know, oh, that's a certificate and that's for this type of thing. What type of formats are we going to be needing to be familiarized with?
Okay, so it depends on what it is that you're actually going for. If you're going for something that you don't care if it's human readable, all right, you're going to be using one of these. And this is something known as the Distinguished Encoding Rules. It's a .dir format, if you will. It's essentially a binary encoded, and it doesn't include the private key. You might see other extensions too, like .cer as well associated with it. You also have what's known as the Privacy Enhanced Mail, PEM, and there are various PEM extensions. You also see PEM, you'll see CERT, CER. I believe CER and CERT, these are Microsoft implementations of PEM. You will see PEM as well in other non-Microsoft environments. Now, there's a little bit difference, right, in this one. Now, we talked about when we showed you setting up the PKI that when I made a CSR, sorry for the acronym, the certificates signing request, and I need to, hey, can I have that certificate? I'm a user, right? And we said that it's essentially human readable information. That's what this is. This is that base 64 ASCII encoded that says begin certificate. It's got a whole bunch of information in between. It says end certificate. That's it. These two formats here, they're really pretty much the same. The difference is one's binary, it's not human readable. The other one is human readable. Not easy to say it, but easier to read it.
Those dirty humans.
Humans, that's right. We got a couple more that we need to worry about. And now, I'm going to go ahead and let me just bring these two. I know there's a whole bunch of information. If you want to pause the video, all right? The difference between the two PKCS standards is, do you want to export the private key? We've been talking about a good way to publish the public key is to export it. Export the public key, right? And you can put it up on a billboard like I think Dan mentioned in the PKI show, all right? It's because it doesn't include the private key, all right? Now, if I need to, let's say I need to take a CA offline, all right? The machine, it needs a new hard drive, needs new memory, right? And I think I might have to blow away the operating system, reinstall Active Directory, reinstall the Active Directory Certificate Services role, and bring up the subordinate CA again. When I do that, if I want to use the existing key that we had before, I had to take the machine down for maintenance. I need to export the public key, the private key, and any attributes associated with that key. So if I need the private key to be exported, then what I'm going to use is I'm going to use the 12. Now, pay attention to some of the information. Be able to recognize them on the exam and know why I would use one over the other, right? Real easy. Binary encoded, not human readable. PEM, base 64, begin certificate, end certificate. PKCS 7 exports the public key, not the private key. Number 12, exports the private, public, certificate chain, and all the extended attributes associated with it.
All right. Well, Wes, this was definitely a brain full of information. So take your time with this. This is the kind of things that can kind of get you twisted around. We're not going to make those flashcards for, but we did today look at the different types of certificates that we might use and in the ways that we might use them, as well as the formats that are common to certificates. That being said, we are out of time for this episode. Not to fret. There's more to come in the Security Plus series, and we do hope to see you then. Until then, have a great day, everyone.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.